All right, let's get started with today's deep dive. We're heading north today, way north, to the Arctic.
Ooh, exciting.
Yeah, it's not exactly a tropical vacation spot, though I guess it is getting a bit warmer these days. But that's kind of the point, right? We're not here to talk about,
Yeah.
polar bears and ice fishing this time around.
Right. Those are definitely interesting topics.
Totally. But today it's all about the Arctic's growing role in global politics, and particularly the increasing military activity in the region.
It's becoming a real geopolitical hotspot.
Exactly. Our main source for this deep dive is a report from the Canadian Press by Kyle Duggan, published just a few days ago on December 30th, 2024.
I'm familiar with that one. Yeah, it really highlights how the Arctic is transforming from this, quiet, remote area into a place where countries are vying for resources and strategic advantage.
Right, in a place where, things could potentially get a little heated.
That-
Speaking of things heating up, the report details a pretty significant event that happened back in July. China and Russia conducted their first ever joint air patrol in the Arctic. And, get this, it was near Alaska.
Wow, near Alaska. That's pretty bold, I'd say.
Yeah, that definitely got the attention of North American Aerospace Defense Command, or as most people know them, NORAD.
I can see why they'd be concerned. I mean, this is the first time China and Russia have conducted a joint air patrol in the Arctic. It's definitely a sign of their growing cooperation and their increasing interest in the region.
I'm curious, what's your take on this cooperation? Is it just posturing, or is there something more to it?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but it definitely sends a message that these two countries are willing to work together to project their power in the Arctic.
And what kind of message do you think they're trying to send?
Well, it could be a way of showing the U.S. and Canada that they need to take their interests in the Arctic seriously. It could also be a way for China and Russia to test each other's capabilities and to see how well they can work together.
So, a bit of a power play, maybe a little bit of testing the waters.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. But it's important to remember that this cooperation between Russia and China, it's not quite at the same level as the military integration we see between the U.S. and Canada.
You're saying it's not a full-blown military alliance yet.
Exactly. It's more like, think of it like two dancers learning a new routine together.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So they're coordinating their movements, figuring out how to work together, but they're not exactly Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers yet.
Right. They haven't quite reached that level of seamless integration.
That makes sense. So while this joint patrol is definitely something to keep an eye on, it's not necessarily an immediate cause for alarm.
Right. But it's important to be aware of the potential implications of this cooperation, especially as China and Russia continue to increase their presence in the Arctic.
And it's not just China and Russia that we need to be thinking about, right? The report also mentions increasing coordination between other potential adversaries, like North Korea and Iran.
Yeah, it's a complex web of relationships, and it's all playing out in this increasingly important region. So it's definitely something that NORAD and other Western nations are monitoring very closely.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got Russia and China kind of dipping their toes in the Arctic waters together. But what about the relationship between the U.S. and Canada, the two countries at the heart of NORAD?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, because despite some political tensions, particularly when it comes to Canada's defense spending, the July incident actually showcased just how strong the military ties between those two countries really are.
So you're saying that when push comes to shove, the U.S. and Canada are still a united front?
Absolutely. The report highlights how Canadian CF-18s seamlessly integrated with U.S. F-16s and F-35 to respond to that joint patrol. I mean, that kind of coordination, that level of interoperability, it doesn't just happen overnight.
It was more than just showing up and flying in formation.
Way more. It takes years of joint training, shared procedures, and a really deep level of trust to achieve that kind of interoperability. You need to be able to anticipate each other's moves, to communicate effectively, to trust that the other guy has your back.
Makes sense. It's like a well-oiled machine or maybe a well-rehearsed dance routine, to bring back that analogy.
Exactly. And it shows that despite any public disagreements they might have, when it comes to defending North America, the U.S. and Canada are still rock solid.
Okay, so that's reassuring. But you mentioned that Russia has been stepping up its activity in the Arctic, even aside from this partnership with China.
Right. There have been a number of incidents in recent months that have raised concerns.
Like what? What kind of incidents?
Well, for example, in late September, Russian bombers were spotted near Alaska. Again, this isn't necessarily unusual, but it's part of a pattern of increased activity that has people on edge.
And I imagine those bombers aren't the only thing keeping NORAD busy these days.
You're right. There's also the issue of Russian submarines operating in the Arctic, which are much harder to track and can pose a significant threat.
Oh, wow. So it's a multi-dimensional challenge,
Yeah.
not just about planes in the sky anymore.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting and maybe a little bit concerning.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So during one of these intercepts in September, a Russian fighter jet acted, let's just say, unprofessionally.
Unprofessionally. What does that mean in this context? Did they, give the U.S. pilot the finger?
Well, not quite, but it was close. They maneuvered dangerously close to a U.S. aircraft. It was what's called an unprofessional intercept.
Okay, so that sounds pretty serious. What are the implications of that kind of behavior?
Well, it raises concerns about the potential for miscalculations or even accidents that could escalate tensions in the region.
Right, because one wrong move and things could spiral out of control pretty quickly, I imagine.
Exactly. And that's a big worry, especially given the already heightened sensitivities in the Arctic right now.
So it's like playing with fire.
Pretty much. And it's something that NORAD is very aware of.
So how are they responding to these challenges?
Well, the report introduces us to General Gregory Guillot, the head of NORAD. He's very vocal about the challenges they're facing, particularly when it comes to Russia's ability to threaten North America from increasingly longer distances.
So it's not just about Russian bombers flying near Alaska anymore. They can project power from much further away.
Exactly. They have new missiles that can reach North America from deep within Russian territory, and they're developing new submarines that are quieter and harder to detect.
That makes NORAD's job a whole lot harder.
You got it. And it means they have to focus more on early detection and response, which stretches their resources and makes their job that much more complex.
So what's the solution? How do you defend against threats that are getting farther away and more sophisticated?
Well, General Guillot believes the answer lies in, you guessed it, increased exercises and operations in the Arctic.
So basically beefing up their presence in the region.
Yeah, basically. They need to have more planes in the air, more ships in the water, more troops on the ground, and more sensors to detect potential threats.
And that's not cheap, I imagine.
Not at all. But Guillot argues that it's essential to deter aggression and to protect North America from these evolving threats.
I guess you can't put a price on security.
Exactly. And it's not just about the quantity of forces, it's also about making sure they're properly trained and equipped to operate in the harsh Arctic environment.
Because it's not exactly a walk in the park up there, is it?
Definitely not. You're talking about extreme cold, unpredictable weather, limited visibility, and vast distances. It's a whole different ballgame compared to operating in, say, the Nevada desert.
I can only imagine. So how do you train for that?
Well, it involves a lot of specialized equipment, of course, but it also requires a shift in mindset. You have to be prepared for the unexpected, to be able to adapt to changing conditions, and to be comfortable operating in a very isolated and unforgiving environment.
It sounds like it takes a special kind of soldier to thrive in that environment.
It does, and that's why General Guillot is putting so much emphasis on training and acclimatization. He wants to make sure that NORAD forces are ready for anything the Arctic can throw at them.
And it sounds like he's not just talking the talk, he's actually walking the walk. The report mentioned that he recently visited Cold Lake, Alberta, where he flew in a CF-18.
Yep. He wanted to experience firsthand what it's like to operate in the Canadian Arctic, and he's also planning a trip to Inuvik in the Northwest Territories to observe operations there.
So he's really getting a feel for the challenges on the ground.
He is, and that's important because it shows that he's serious about understanding the unique challenges of operating in the Arctic, and that he's committed to making sure that NORAD forces are properly prepared.
So we've got increased exercises, a focus on acclimatization, and a commitment to understanding the Arctic environment. What other steps are being taken to enhance defense capabilities in the region?
Well, one crucial aspect is training on advanced aircraft, particularly fifth-generation fighter jets like the F-35. The report mentions that the U.S. is hosting Canadian pilots at Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska to train on these cutting-edge aircraft.
Why is training on the F-35 so important for Arctic operations? Is it just about having the newest, shiniest toy?
No, not at all. The F-35 has specific capabilities that make it well-suited for the challenging Arctic environment. For one thing, it has stealth technology, which makes it harder to detect by radar, especially important in a region where radar coverage can be limited.
So it's like a ghost in the sky.
Kind of, yeah. It can slip in and out of enemy territory undetected, which gives it a huge advantage.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What about those other capabilities you mentioned? What else makes the F-35 so special?
Well, it also boasts advanced sensors that can detect and track targets over long distances, even in conditions of low visibility. Plus, it has a longer range compared to older fighter jets, which is essential when you're patrolling a vast area like the Arctic.
So it's not just about flying fast and carrying weapons. It's about having the right tools for the job, especially in a place as unforgiving as the Arctic.
You got it. And that's why this training on the F-35 is so vital. It's about making sure that both the U.S. and Canada can operate effectively in the Arctic's increasingly complex airspace.
It sounds like we've covered a lot of ground already, and this Arctic story is getting more and more interesting. But we're just getting started.
And, operating the F-35 up in the Arctic, it's a whole different ballgame for pilots.
Yeah, I bet. What are some of the challenges that make the Arctic such a unique training ground?
Well, just for starters, you've got that extreme cold.
Yeah, that's got to be tough on the equipment and on the pilots themselves.
Oh, absolutely. It can affect everything from fuel efficiency to how well the weapon systems perform.
I hadn't even thought about that.
And then there's the issue of limited daylight during certain times of the year, those long Arctic nights.
Right, that must make things pretty tricky for pilots.
It does. It means they have to adapt their tactics and rely more on instruments and sensor technology instead of just what they can see out the window.
Yeah, it's got to be like flying in a completely different world.
It is. Plus, you've got the vast distances up there and very little in the way of infrastructure.
Right, not a lot of places to land if something goes wrong.
Exactly. So navigation and communication are a lot more difficult compared to other regions.
It sounds like it takes a special kind of pilot to handle all that.
It does. And that's why this training program at Eielson Air Force Base is so important. It gives those Canadian pilots the chance to get some hands-on experience operating the F-35 alongside their American counterparts.
So they can build up that trust and understanding that we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It's all about teamwork, especially in a high-pressure environment like that.
Like a professional sports team practicing together before the big game.
Perfect analogy. You need that shared understanding, that trust, to function effectively as a team.
Right, because one weak link can bring down the whole team.
Absolutely. And remember, this training, it's not just about the pilots either.
Oh, right, there's a whole support system behind them.
Exactly. You've got ground crews, maintenance personnel, support staff, all working together to make sure these sophisticated aircraft can operate up in that demanding region.
So it's really a massive logistical undertaking.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But it shows just how committed both countries are to maintaining a strong defense posture in the Arctic.
Right. And I imagine that commitment is only going to grow in the years to come.
Absolutely, especially as the Arctic becomes more accessible and more strategically important.
And as those potential threats we talked about earlier continue to evolve.
Exactly. It's a constantly shifting landscape, both literally and figuratively.
So we've talked about the military buildup, the training, the potential threats. What about the other side of the coin? The environmental concerns that are also front and center in the Arctic these days.
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge part of the story, too. And it's one that's often overlooked when people focus on the military aspects.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in the talk of fighter jets and submarines and forget that the Arctic is also this incredibly fragile ecosystem that's under threat.
Exactly. And the threats are only increasing as the ice melts and the region becomes more accessible.
Yeah, I mean, you've got new shipping routes opening up, access to natural resources like oil and gas.
Right, all of which is attracting a lot of interest from countries and corporations around the world.
It's like a giant treasure chest is slowly opening up, and everyone wants a piece of what's inside.
That's a great way to put it. And it really highlights the need for a balanced approach to development up there.
Because if we're not careful, all that economic activity could have a devastating impact on the environment.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to have clear regulations and international agreements in place to manage these resources responsibly and to prevent environmental damage.
So how do we strike that balance? How do we make sure that economic development doesn't come at the expense of the environment?
Well, that's where organizations like the Arctic Council come in.
I've heard of them, but I'm not really sure what they do.
They're kind of like the UN for the Arctic. They bring together the 8 Arctic nations: Canada, the U.S., Russia, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Sweden, and Finland.
So it's a way for these countries to work together on issues that affect the entire region.
Exactly. They meet regularly to discuss things like climate change, sustainable development, scientific research, and of course, security concerns.
So it's not just about individual countries asserting their claims, it's about recognizing that the Arctic is a shared responsibility.
That's the idea. And the Arctic Council provides a forum for these countries to find common ground and to work towards solutions that benefit everyone.
That sounds encouraging. It seems like the Arctic Council could be a key player in shaping a sustainable future for the region.
It could be. But like any international organization, it faces its own challenges. Reaching consensus among 8 countries with diverse interests can be tough, and enforcing agreements can be even tougher.
Right, because there's no global police force that can step in and make everyone follow the rules.
Exactly. So the Arctic Council relies heavily on diplomacy, cooperation, and good faith.
So it's a work in progress, but at least it's a step in the right direction.
It is. And it shows that there's a growing recognition that the Arctic is a global commons, that it requires a collective approach.
Which is a good thing, because the challenges facing the Arctic, they're not going away anytime soon.
No, they're not. And if anything, they're only going to become more complex and more urgent as time goes on.
So it's more important than ever for these Arctic nations to work together to find solutions.
Absolutely. And that's why the Arctic Council is so important. It provides a platform for dialogue, for cooperation, and hopefully for progress.
So we've talked about the military activities, the environmental concerns, the role of international cooperation. But what about the economic opportunities that are driving all this increased interest in the Arctic?
Right, we can't forget about that because as the ice melts and the region becomes more accessible, those opportunities are only going to grow.
And that's going to create both challenges and opportunities, I imagine.
It will. One of the biggest opportunities, of course, is access to natural resources.
Like the oil and gas we talked about earlier.
Exactly, and also minerals like iron ore, copper, nickel, diamonds. There's a lot of potential wealth locked up in the Arctic. And as the ice recedes, it's becoming easier and cheaper to extract those resources.
I can see how that would be tempting for a lot of countries and companies.
It is. And that's why it's so important to have those regulations and international agreements in place to make sure that the exploitation of these resources is done responsibly and sustainably.
Because the potential for conflict is definitely there, right? If everyone is rushing in to grab a piece of the pie.
Absolutely. That's why organizations like the Arctic Council are so important. They provide a forum for these countries to work out their differences and to come up with rules that everyone can agree on.
So it's not just about protecting the environment, it's about preventing conflict and promoting stability in the region as well.
Exactly. And it's about making sure that the economic benefits of Arctic development are shared equitably among all the stakeholders, including the indigenous peoples who have lived in the Arctic for centuries.
Right, because they have a lot at stake in all of this.
They do. And their voices need to be heard as decisions are made about the future of the Arctic.
So it's a very complex equation, balancing economic development, environmental protection, the interests of indigenous peoples, and the security concerns of all the Arctic nations.
It is. And it's an equation that's constantly evolving. As the Arctic continues to change, so too will the challenges and the opportunities that it presents.
It's a reminder that the Arctic is not just some far-off, isolated region.
No, it's not. What happens there has ripple effects that can be felt around the world.
From global trade patterns to climate change, the Arctic is connected to us all.
And it's a region that we need to pay attention to, both for the challenges it presents and for the opportunities it offers.
Absolutely. Well, that's a lot to think about. But I think it's a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the Arctic.
It really is. And, one of the biggest challenges up there in the Arctic is figuring out how to make sure any economic development is done, sustainably without messing things up for good.
Right, yeah, because it's easy to imagine that with all that oil and gas just waiting to be tapped, people might get a little hasty.
Oh, for sure, especially if there aren't any clear rules in place.
And that's where the Arctic Council comes in, right? But they're
Well,
kind of like the referees, making sure everyone plays fair.
Yeah, exactly. They're not exactly a police force, but they do set standards, share information, and try to get everyone on the same page when it comes to protecting the environment.
So kind of like a rule book for the Arctic.
Right, and it's really important that they're there because when it comes to the environment, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic.
Exactly. Those environmental issues, they don't respect national borders.
No, climate change is a perfect example. It's affecting the whole region, no matter who you are.
Melting ice, rising sea levels, crazy weather patterns, it's all happening up there.
And it's happening faster in the Arctic than anywhere else on the planet.
Which is pretty scary when you think about it.
It is. The Arctic is warming at like twice the rate of the rest of the world. So it's a real warning sign for what's to come.
So what we do in the Arctic today, it matters for everyone, everywhere.
Absolutely. It's all connected.
It's kind of overwhelming, all these challenges facing the Arctic.
It can be, but there are a lot of people working hard to protect this region.
Yeah, like those scientists and researchers we talked about earlier.
And policymakers, indigenous communities, they're all working to make sure the Arctic stays healthy for future generations.
It's inspiring to see that level of commitment.
It is, and it gives me hope that we can find a way to balance all these competing interests and protect this incredible part of the world.
It's a reminder that we're all connected and that the choices we make today, they matter for everyone, everywhere.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap things up for today. We've covered a lot of ground in this Arctic deep dive.
We have, from military exercises to climate change to the delicate balance between economic development and environmental protection. It's a complex story, and it's only going to get more complex in the years to come.
But hopefully, by understanding the challenges and the opportunities that the Arctic presents, we can work together to create a more sustainable and peaceful future for this incredible region.
I agree, and I think that's a message worth sharing with the world.
Absolutely. So to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Arctic. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged, because what happens up north affects us all.